Hypertrophy, team. This is the big one. People love hypertrophy. So let's deep dive into this long form discussion about it so we can really get into the weeds of how to program for it. All right, team, you're here with me, Coach Chicken Legs. Hypertrophy or muscle growth, one of the biggest things that clients ask you for when they come into in a general gym sense. It's the two things that you're almost always going to run into, team, for your general populace is weight loss and muscle gain. Those two are absolutely the kings, the creme de la creme of things you're going to program for in your journey as a personal trainer. It just is. Why? Because people want to look good naked. And to do that, you either have to have less body fat or more muscle or a combination of the two. So you're really commonly going to find that thinner, smaller people are going to want more muscle mass and larger people are going to want more weight loss. Very popular, at least in my experience, in the younger male populace. They often want to look bigger and be stronger. That's fine. But keep in mind that when you're selling programs, understand who has the cash potential to help you and who doesn't. There are people inside the sport of bodybuilding who are very, very good at muscle mass gain, but you must keep your clients in the correct spectrum that understand that without performance enhancing drugs, sometimes the looks that they're trying to achieve aren't actually possible. Okay. So keeping that in mind, let's deep dive into a bit of the science, some of the metrics and programs that we're going to use for hypertrophy itself. So, really important that when it comes to hypertrophy, you nail warm-ups, you nail the body of work, and you nail cool down. So having a basic understanding with some of the other videos we've talked about in relation to those spaces is really important, because once we've got our warm-up basic information ticked and awesome, our body of work, our general information around how we program. So that's about rep ranges, and that's about why we look at heart rate variability, linear versus translate versus movements, that kind of stuff. A basic understanding around that spot, like what are reps, what are sets, what's a superset, that kind of stuff. Really important. And our cool down, you need to understand that we use cool downs to help make our body more relaxed into its rest and digest state, and we use it to lengthen out muscle tissue and deload joints that have been squished. Once we know that the warm-ups to ramp us up so that way we're nice and warm and ready, and our neurological systems are ready to train. Our body is all about stimulating a response, whether that be weight loss, muscle growth, or whatever. And cool down is all about getting us back down to a normal functional human level of function. That's a really good base of understanding for our different steps of the warm-up, cool down, and body, and our workout. Since you have that information, you can now start blanketing it over the concepts around hypertrophy. So team, let's just dive straight into it so that way we can start, so we don't go on forever, because hypertrophy is a big topic. Progressive overload. Really important topic to understand as a hypertrophy coach. Your client doesn't need to understand it too badly, but you certainly do. And it just means that you are over time, so progressively over time, increasing the load or time under tension that a muscle is experiencing. That will create muscle growth. So over a long and longer time horizon, you are forever increasing the amount of load that it's experiencing, load being either the weight, the time under tension, the reps, whatever, so that the muscle has a reason to grow. Muscles will not grow without a reason. If they're not stimulated in just the right way, they will not grow bigger for you. If they're not fed just the right way, they will not grow for you. And if you are not resting just the right amount, they will not grow for you. So the idea of progressive overload is over time, we continue the stimulation that is resulting in muscle gain to continue muscle gain. If you continually give your muscles the same level of load, you will stop growing. And you will see this in clients who achieved a little bit of muscle growth at the start of their program and then plateau out. It's not what we want. We want our clients to receive a bit of growth, have a rest, and then receive more growth. So they're forever going up and down over time. But you'll see guys in the gym who are lifting the same amount of weights over and over and over again, and they have for many, many years, and they've stopped growing, but because what they used to do worked, they don't deviate. Or they've hit a natural limit of capacity, so they couldn't physically do any more if they wanted to. Okay, so for example, they couldn't put any more on the leg press if they wanted to because the weight's so high. So now they need to start looking at time under tension or the amount of reps they're doing. Good rule of thumb is between 10 and 20 hard sets per muscle group will usually result in growth. Notice the word hard there. Hard sets, team, meaning that a set that's pushing you closer and closer to failure. Okay? When we think hard sets, team, we're looking at 65 to 85% of your 1RM, your 1 rep max on that movement. It's super important that throughout your programming, you are always testing people, you're always documenting load, because 1RMs are a common metric we use to discover if we're going hard enough during our sets. Notice that it's not 90 and above. That's because we need to work the muscle lots to failure, and keeping it in a safer bubble, a lower weight bubble, is usually going to be better for you because you're forcing a muscle to go until it no longer can, which can be perceived as really dangerous and can result in injury. So we have to make sure that the weight isn't so much that we can't handle it, particularly because we're going to play with moderately high rep ranges. We're probably going to play with between 6 and 12 reps per set. Now, that's not a set rule, okay? Like, you can grow muscle in below 6 reps and you can grow muscle in above 12 reps. Totally reasonable. However, just to keep it general, because as you get better, you'll deep dive yourself, but as a general rule of thumb, we are aiming for the client to fail between 6 and 12 reps. This is their Goldilocks zone. Meaning that if they get more than 12 reps, it's an indicator that perhaps the load you've given them is too easy. And if they get less than 6 reps, it's an indicator that the load you've given them is probably too hard. That's okay. But we want them to fail or be unable to continue, which is failure, between 6 and 12 reps. There is another factor that we're looking for in hypertrophy, and it is cadence, or time under tension. What does that mean? It means that when we're doing reps, we do them slow and controlled. So each rep might take anywhere between 3 and 6 seconds. Why? Because when we do stuff slowly, team, we can feel and focus on isolating the muscle that we're trying to use for growth. If I swing stuff or move stuff quickly, then you'll find that more than one muscle is usually recruited, and the forces of inertia and momentum will start coming into factor, taking away the load from the muscle you're trying to target. That's one reason that we really like slow and controlled, because we're trying to isolate specific things. We also like slow and controlled because since we're trying to go to the point of complete failure, where we cannot continue even if we wanted to, you don't want to do that kind of training fast and hard because it usually results in an injury. If I'm slowly contracting and moving the muscle, that when it truly does fatigue, I won't go beyond and I won't tear other things because I'm going in a space that I can feel and think and control any risk of injury. Okay, super important. That is something I need you to factor in, is that slow and controlled cadence. Another thing I need you to remember is that there's compound movements and there is isolation movements. Isolation, something like that. Why is this relevant? Why do you care? Well, compound movements is recruiting many muscles to do something, and isolation movements is isolating a movement to do something, and they both serve different purposes. They follow the same rules here, that we like 10 to 12 hard sets. We like 10 to 20 hard sets over the period of your week, not over your session, over your week. We like 65 to 85% of the 1RM. We like 6 to 12 reps, and we like slow and controlled. Hey team, if you're liking this content, what I need you to do is follow us, support us, leave comments. We're here to help programmers be better at programming, make coaches and PTs the best of the best that we can, and it starts with programming and it starts with you. Share, like, subscribe. When we're trying to hit many muscles, we use compound movements, because as we go through a squat, we use many muscles of the lower limb. So we can use all the different parts of the quad, we can use our hamstrings, we can use our lower backs, our glutes, all the things factor in some capacity, which means we'll get lots of growth in that area. However, nothing specific, okay? So if there's one muscle that's more dominant, that will grow more than the things that are perhaps just facilitating the movement. And then we have isolation movements that are all about finding specific muscles and stimulating them to grow. They both have their purposes. Compound's really good at getting lots of stuff big quickly and hitting these harder sets on lots of things. Like if we're doing the squats, we hit lots of aspects of the muscles of the legs, versus when we do isolation stuff, we might just get ourselves in a seated calf raise and isolate the actual calf, the soleus itself, to grow that dish shape that is the gastrocnemius. Sorry, that is the calf itself. So we love compound movements because we can get out lots of hard sets, and we love isolation movements because we can help things catch up to our overall body growth. Isolation movements, however, the issue that they have is that if I need to do 10 to 20 hard sets per week on each muscle, I'm probably going to end up living in the gym, which a lot of bodybuilding people do, particularly people who are pros. They might come 2 to 3 times a day for hours a day. So that's the issue that isolation runs into. And the issue that compound movements run into is that since it is so global in general, it's a challenge to grow specific things, because if I'm doing a deadlift, I'm doing using so many muscles. I'm not necessarily recruiting one thing. I'm using my whole body. So it's hard to fatigue certain muscles because other muscles will take over as the muscle that you want to grow kind of taps out. Does that make sense? So you might have felt it yourself when you've been doing bench press and you've been really focused on the chest, and on the last 2 or 3 reps when you feel very spent, you feel your front deltoid take over to help you do the movement still. Your body is very clever at continuing you through movement, but it will do it at the cost of the goal you're trying to achieve. So our cadence is nice and slow. We have our Goldilocks zone of between 6 and 12 reps, although you will get growth on either end. You love the 65 to 85% of your 1RM. You want between 10 and 20 hard sets for each muscle group a week, and you love compound and isolation movements, okay? These are great things. These are things that build around your hypertrophy, okay? This is the stuff that's gonna allow you to have growth. When it comes to hypertrophy, our goal is to have as much metabolic stimulation as we can, or muscle stimulation as we can. So rest in this case will vary a little bit. So rest for hypertrophy, I like to go off the rule that if something is lower intensity, let's say I'm focusing on just isolating a bicep, since it's not very big, it won't generate too much actual elevated heart rate, so it's not too challenging. It's a lower intensity activity. Lower intensity activities get a rest ratio of 1:1, meaning if it took them a minute to do it, we're going to give them a minute rest. For middle intensity activities, think now perhaps shoulder overhead press, where we've got a compound movement that's got lots of different muscles involved, and it's going to elevate your heart rate because there's more things functioning, but it's not going to blow you out of the water. We like a rest ratio of about 1.5 to 1. So if it takes you a minute, you're going to get a minute and a half rest. And if it's high intensity, think big squats that you're absolutely dying under, you might get a rest ratio of 1 minute on to 2 minutes rest. Okay, that will increase as needed, but the overall goal of hypertrophy is all about trying to create this metabolic disruption, this stimulant of the body. So the less rest you often give yourself, the more chance you're going to have of stimulating the body. Now, with that in mind, I need you to consider that you can overdo it. You can't have no rest at all. Otherwise, you're not going to give your body time to heal, recharge, and allow you to do the exercise again. But shorter rest ranges within reason, depending on what you're doing, are going to help you with more growth in theory. Some people will like more rest time so they can perform the exercise more and more. Some people like less rest time. A good rule of thumb is if you are tracking your clients' metrics and you are tracking their actual reps and weights, which you should be, you might expect a client to be able to do about 13 reps of 20 kilos of this movement that we will call the bicep curl. If your client on the day has just done 2 sets and they've done their 13 reps of 20 kilos and it was to failure and they did a really good job, if you shorten the rest time that you've been giving them and find that now they can only do 11 reps per set or 9 reps per set or whatever, you might then determine that you're not giving them enough rest time for the movement. As long as they're staying within their rep range, their 6 to 12 hypertrophy rep range that we are using for hypertrophy, if we find that the rest time is dictating that they're not getting at least 6 reps, that's probably a good indicator that the rest is either not long enough or the weight is too challenging. So as we shorten rest times for clients to try to increase this muscle stimulant, if you shorten it too much, a good test that you have is that they just won't get their 6 reps, which is great. That's a really good way to tell if you're doing too much or too little. Team, choosing exercises for clients for bodybuilding will completely depend on their goals. For example, most clients will want to get generally bigger. So they want to get bigger in the whole body, but then they'll have specific muscles that they want to have bigger along the way. For example, they might want bigger calves and bigger biceps, whatever. But they still want overall growth, but their legs and biceps are the things they want focus on. So a good thing is that most clients will be able to tell you what they want out of the session. That's awesome. We love that. But what I would expect you guys to do, and something I really encourage for personal trainers, is in the back of your mind, you should have a couple of exercises per main section of the body and a couple of exercises for specific muscles. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if we go arms, lower body, back, core, chest, these are just global areas of the body. So I've got big arms, or I've got big legs, or I've got big whatever. These are very general areas, and you as a personal trainer should have 2 to 3 exercises in your back pocket that you know will in general grow these areas. So for battle ropes for arms perhaps, or a sled for lower body, back you might have pull-ups, or something that's a bit global, right? As you get better and you've got more than 1 to 3 exercises per of these areas, you'll then start going, well, now I need exercises for specific muscles. I can make these areas in general grow, but what if I want to grow specific things? Let's say I want to specifically grow the tricep or the bicep, or I want to specifically grow the soleus or the gastrocnemius, which are the muscles of the calf. Do I have 1 to 3 or at least 1 exercise for each individual muscle? You don't need to be an anatomist, but it does help to have an understanding of the general muscles of the body. So you should know that there is the pecs, which is the chest, you should know tricep. You should know trapezium or trapezius or whatever they call it, traps here on the top of your shoulders. You should know your pecs. You should know biceps, triceps, traps, lats, rhomboids. You should know front head of the deltoid, lateral, rear. You should know your quadriceps, which are the front muscles of the thighs, your hamstrings, your calves, your soleus, your gastrocnemius. These things you should know. The specific muscles of the journey. That's probably relevant for you as you get better. Then, if you level up even further, you can then go to the very specific muscles of the body. So you can start looking at the actual different heads of the quadricep, the different vastices. You can start looking at the different heads of the hamstring. You can start looking at the upper pecs and the lower pecs and the inside head of the tricep and the outside head of the tricep. So as you progress, if you decide that hypertrophy is your goal, that is the area you're going to study and become a pro programmer in, you can start becoming more and more specific. So think of it as levels. So level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 1 is global areas. So that's going to be arms, back, legs, chest, whatever. You're then going to have level 2 clients or level 2 programmers, which is like triceps, biceps, front deltoid, lateral deltoid, rear deltoid. So you're starting to understand the actual specific muscles of the areas. Then we're going to start so this is a bit more specific. And then we're going to look at mastery, which is when you know upper pecs, lower pecs, whole pec, the different heads of the tricep, the different heads of the quad itself, right? So almost you're not as good as an anatomist, but the more specific you can get on those muscles, and probably ones that you'll commonly see in the gym setting, the better you're going to be long term if you decide to go down the hypertrophy track. So if you start doing training with a client and you notice that their quads are growing because you're measuring it and that's what you're doing, but you see that the actual teardrop of the leg isn't growing at the same kind of rate that everything else is, you can start isolating that muscle more specifically. So these are things that will start translating really well as you progress in your hypertrophy as a coach and programmer. There are 3 pillars inside hypertrophy. Okay? Let's draw them up. Pillar 1 is your program. If you have a shit program or you're not got a program that has the things we've discussed in mind, then your client is going to not get any growth, or they're going to stagnate, or they're going to stop progressing the way you want them to. And that's no good. That's not what we want. Okay? If your client has poor nutrition, or their nutrition program is not up to snuff, then they're going to stagnate as well. So we use nutrition to fuel the growth of the muscle and fuel the ability to do what we want the muscle to do. So you must have an excellent understanding of nutrition if you want to be a hypertrophy coach. And then we must have a good rest regime, a sleep routine, a recovery routine. We must have good recovery inside our 3 pillars. Otherwise, we cannot grow. If you have fantastic programming in nutrition, but you don't get any sleep, you're not giving the body time to grow and heal, so your progress will be significantly reduced, and so too true will be your clients. If you're program shit, but you're resting and you're sleeping well, you're not giving the body the stimulant to grow, so it just won't. Okay? There's a lot to it, team. When you're doing hypertrophy for clients, you need to be very on, because you're tracking lots and lots of metrics. You're tracking their rest, their stretching, their height, all of this stuff, their recovery, their muscle lengthening, their joint decompression. We're looking at their nutrition constantly, because we have to make sure they're in a slight surplus, and also having the meals that are appropriate for them. And we must make sure their program is up to snuff, and we're tracking all the different metrics within their programming. So there's a lot of stuff you've got to track in this context, which can be really intimidating for newer coaches. But if you love hypertrophy, this is the kind of things that you're going to start focusing on as you write programs for clients and even for yourself, okay? I want to look at some pros and cons now. There's pros and cons to all training styles, but for hypertrophy, let's look at some of the big ones. Pros, this can be very fun for clients, okay? Hypertrophy is really good for older populace because as they start getting older their muscles will start naturally atrophying and their bone density will start naturally decreasing. So trying to make sure that the client's continuously getting more and more muscle growth is going to be really good because that way the client will offset some of the age-related issues that people run into. It's really, really good for younger clients like teenagers and younger men who are trying to look good aesthetically in their lives. This is a very quick way to do it. It's very quick to grow muscle, which is what we want. Quick muscle grow. Within reason, team, there's no such thing as quick muscle growth unless you're doing something you shouldn't. But muscle takes time to grow. I always say it's between 200 and 400 grams per month if you've got a perfect nutrition, perfect sleep regime, and a perfect diet, like diet or nutrition regime. However, that will vary, but 200 to 400 grams is kind of what I expect for most clients each month, probably more towards 200 than 400. We're also looking at, for pros, it's moderately and quite normally safer for newer clients to do because isolation exercises are good for safe, slow and controlled movements. So clients who are a bit more apprehensive and are not used to running around and throwing balls and doing a CrossFit style workout will probably gravitate more to the slow and controlled nature that is hypertrophy. Pro is that the majority of the population as well will want some aspect of muscle growth inside their training. So having a basic understanding is probably a good thing. That's pretty decent for the pros. Let's be real, there are a shit ton more cons because it's almost like a sport in itself. There's a lot of sports like bodybuilding built around around hypertrophy training. Most sports in general will be better and you will have a client who is better if they're stronger. That's a good rule of thumb. So hypertrophy training is often done with sporting groups. However, muscle growth by itself runs into a few issues. Issue one is that you're almost always in the linear space. So meaning that your shoulders and hips don't really rotate or change from the positions that they're in. That means that you're likely to develop some niggles that would usually be offset by rotation. So if you think about a farmer and farmer strength and farmer longevity, they're twisting and turning and lifting stuff as if they're at a gym, but they're also quite practically strong. So some of bodybuilding style training doesn't translate particularly well to other things, and you can start getting quite compressed and condensed into the linear space, which can develop niggles. Remember that your goal is to tear muscle. You're tearing it not so much that you have an injury, but not so little that it doesn't grow. So that means that the muscle is often sore. The muscle will shorten as it tears from over time. So we need to make sure we're constantly stretching it out. And you're also constantly compressing joints when doing this form of training. So without a good recovery program, you'll almost always lead clients down to a process of injury, which is not what we want either. Okay. The big one for people is it's massively time consuming, massively, because remember that we're trying to do between 10, 20 hard sets per muscle group. If a set takes you 2 minutes and you got to do 5 sets per exercise, you got to do 4 exercises minimum in a week, you're looking at hours and hours and hours in your week. So when you want to be true in the bodybuilding sport, you're going to do a lot of time in the gym. If you're just a general client, you might only do 1 session a day, and you might find that you're going to have to rely more on compound movements that hit many muscle groups than isolation. But yeah, super time consuming, team. It's a lot of thought. There's a lot of tracking, lots of tracking. And I'm not saying that the other topics that we're going to touch on don't have tracking involved, but hypertrophy specifically, between the sleep regime, recovery regime, nutrition regime, and programming regime, there is a lot of tracking done, and it can be exhausting, particularly for you as a coach, but probably more so for the client themselves. Okay. Yeah, those are the big ones. I love hypertrophy training, and a lot of my clients love hypertrophy training. There are a lot of cons, and it takes a lot of time. However, it's worth it for a lot of people. And I say it a lot, looking good naked. Good naked. Looking good naked is such a strong goal for people because mental health comes into play in this area particularly. So I get it, but it is a hard path for a lot of people. And I think when you lay down the time frames expected for muscle growth and the kind of work that they want to do to be a pro bodybuilder at least, people often shy away. That's not to say you can't get some amazing results within your hour with your client or within your group class that's hypertrophy focused, or in your camp that you've written you have a hypertrophy style or base perhaps for a camp. You'll still see great results, but to get the truly remarkable in the sports settings stuff, it's going to be a lot of work, and just factor that in for clients. It's very important that you do that. Just very quickly touching on the sciencey stuff, team. I do like to keep these kind of longer form instructionals general because there's so much content and there's so much supportive information that if we deep dive into everything, we would be here all day. And I'd like to keep these relatively short and effective. But we're going to look at maybe just 3 quick sciencey side stuff, things that are going to be relevant to the growth of muscle. Mechanical tension, which is a factor towards hypertrophy, muscle damage, and then metabolic stress. 3 words and 3 phrases you might hear relatively commonly inside the bodybuilding space, or at least on the scientific side of it. Metabolic stress just means that you are creating stress and damage, stress and energy and buildup during movement. It's movement stress, basically. Muscle damage is when we are causing breakdown of tissue to a level that it's now required to grow back stronger, but not so much that there's damage, like long-term damage of the muscle tissue. And mechanical tension is creating tension on specific things mechanically, well, just movements, using movement to create specific tension on specific muscles. A combination of these 3 things with good nutrition and rest will create the growth that you're ever so much seeking. So if we can create mechanical stress, so we can create stress on specific muscles or in compound movement muscles, we can create enough damage that we truly create a tear that's going to heal back stronger. We give it the fuel and the time to do so, and we have the muscle under enough stress that it not only tears but creates the response in us that our body goes, something's not working here, we must be bigger, otherwise we will not be able to do this thing again. And a really cool analogy I was told once was of someone shooting an arrow at a client. And over time, every time that arrow hit the client, a bit of armor would start growing the more times they're hit with the arrow. Now, this is ridiculous. It's superhero stuff. But as the arrow hits, the more and more armor grows. So if the arrow starts hitting the armor, and the armor is stronger than the armor will not grow, okay? So if we keep hitting the same spot with this arrow and the armor starts building up around that space, it will grow to the point where the armor is no longer damaged, okay? And then it will stop growing because the arrow is no longer strong enough to penetrate through the steel, the armor, okay? So a person will have a big armor plate on their shoulder. If the arrow increases in velocity or size to create damage, the muscle will, in theory, keep growing and growing and growing, although it does physically cap eventually. You can't be a mammoth of a person unless you have a health condition. But if the arrow doesn't change, the armor will never grow past what it is needed to do. Now, another part of that analogy is if I stop shooting the arrow at the body, at that armor plate, the armor plate will start fading away because it is no longer needed. Your body is particularly good at building stuff it needs and removing stuff it doesn't. So in this context, your armor will grow if it's being hit and stimulated and shrink if it isn't. So that's why we're constantly training muscles over and over to build as much armor plating as we possibly can around our bodies in areas that we're working. But it does mean that you will continuously need to eat, train, and live in the similar space to maintain the muscle mass. That's why you don't often see people be bodybuilders long term at their maximum size, because it's hard to keep and hold that muscle mass without doing stuff they shouldn't with performance enhancing drugs and stuff. Unless, of course, that's within their sport and within their code of practice and they're happy to do that, then they go for it, right? But that's something I want you to think about. If you stop using it and stimulating it the way you want, you'll lose it. If you stimulate it only enough so that the arrow's no longer hurting you, you will grow no more. If you keep stimulating yourself so that the arrow is getting harder and harder each time, as you plateau, you will continuously see improvement. So if you don't shoot the arrow at all, you will eventually start atrophying, which you see in the older populace, where people become smaller and smaller and their muscles eat away because they're no longer needed. If you shoot the same arrow all the time, your body will build up just enough tolerance to deal with it, and then it will hold long term and will maintain itself. And if you're constantly changing the size of the arrow, the shape of the arrow, how hard you're shooting the arrow, and constantly progressively overloading it, your muscle should continuously go up until it hits your physical capacity, and then it will plateau out until you cannot put any more muscle on ever anyway. You had hit a biological cap. Excellent. These are all the things I want you to think about for hypertrophy team. I will eventually give you hundreds and hundreds of hours and hundreds of programs around hypertrophy, and we will deep dive further into the specific writing at that time. And we have some things in the work that we are soon to release that will give you that content. But for now, have a play with writing around some of those metrics, some of those percentages of outputs that we're trying to do. Have a play with tracking some stuff. Have a play with your rest, your control, your time under tension. Try to see if you can create enough mechanical stress to create tearing. Try it on yourself and understand that muscle growth takes a shit ton of time. The saying we have around here is it's far easier to burn a house down than it is to build a house. Meaning when it comes to weight gain and muscle gain, it takes a very long time comparatively to weight loss that doesn't take as long as fat loss, although in the scheme of the world, it still takes a bit of time. Hopefully that was helpful, team. We will deep dive more into specific programming later, but that's just to give you a good foundation of hypertrophy.